first guest up, Professor Rivera. So, esteemed professor, what were the causes and the consequences of the Spanish-American War?
Well, that's actually a really great question. A major cause was yellow journalism, or exaggerated headlines of magazines and newspapers in order to sell more copies. The supposed Spanish sinking of the USS Maine in Cuba was also a cause. Most of the war was fought in Cuba because the U.S. was protecting Cubans from Spanish tyranny. The funny thing is the government had no plans to annex the Filipinos before the end of the war. The government was pressured into annexing the Philippines by the citizens of the U.S. Protestant ministries who wanted all of the islands. And Wall Street also wanted profits from the islands.
Very nice answer, very nice answer. So my second question. How was American expansionism overseas similar to the previous continental expansion westward, but how is it different?
Wow, well that may be even a better question. Well, the development of the U.S. empire began in the 18th and 19th centuries with the westward expansion of the seaboard colonies and military campaigns against the indigenous North Americans. What began as continental expansion later turned to seizure of overseas territories, for example Hawaii, Guam, and even Puerto Rico. Justifications always relied heavily on religious and moral doctrines of superiority, righteousness, and even manifest destiny.
Well, you're just full of knowledge, aren't you? It's been a pleasure having you. See you next time. You can leave now. Boo, boo, boo! For our next guest, we have Professor Zucker. Why, hello, Professor. So, Professor Zucker, why was the Philippine-American War such a brutal affair? And why is it not as well remembered? Or as less costly as the Spanish-American War?
Well, thank you for such a great question. Well, immediately after Spain ceded the colony of the Philippines to the U.S. in the Treaty of Paris, fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino nationalists who sought independence rather than a change in rulers. The brutal Philippine-American War lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of over 4,200 Americans, as well as over 20,000 Filipino soldiers. More than 200,000 citizens died from violence, famine, and disease. The Spanish-American War was well remembered for the tension caused among the American people because of the explosion of the USS Maine. The yellow journalist newspapers accused the Spanish of oppression in their colonies, and this agitated American public opinion.
Well, you're just a little human textbook, aren't you? So, my next question on the list is, did Roosevelt more often speak softly or use the big stick? Was his approach to foreign policy aggressive or simply energetic?
Well, it's funny because I get that question often. Well, Roosevelt used an aggressive big stick approach to foreign policy. This is evident in his negotiations with Russia and Japan. This becomes even more true if you compare Theodore Roosevelt to the indecisive McKinley during the conflict with Spain and Cuba. While McKinley was unable to prevent war, the reasons for its outbreak were uncertain as he struggled to develop clear objectives. Roosevelt was fight-hungry and sought war aggressively with clearly defined goals in mind. This gives us significant insight as to what kind of presidency he would later have.
Well, that's some great insight you got there. So, last but not least, how did the Roosevelt corollary distort the Monroe Doctrine? And what were the consequences of this Roosevelt corollary for the American relations with Latin America?
Well, the Monroe Doctrine was a statement against imperialism, while the Roosevelt corollary was a declaration of American imperialism. The consequences were a lasting conflict between the Latin American countries and the U.S., and Latin American countries ended up being resentful of the interference of the U.S.
Well, I gotta tell you, you're the best we've had so far on the SCS, or the Sam Cohen Show. Well, thanks a lot.
Well, it's been a pleasure sharing my PhD knowledge with you less intelligent beings.
Thank you. All right.